The book I'm gonna talk about today is 1984 by George Orwell. As I told you right now, the author of this book is George Orwell. He's a famous author who also wrote the book called Animal Farm. He died at the age of 46 at 1950, and although he was unlucky to live a short life, he published dozens of books, including Animal Farm and 1984. These novels were still remembered today to many people in all around the world. So now to talk about the summary of this book is now the background of this book is Oceania, and Oceania is controlled by a group in London, and the group in London was a strict group who were doing the totalitarianism. And the protagonist of this story is Winston Smith, and he is actually one of the members of that group controlling Oceania. Although many other people who are included in the group are proud of themselves, Winston was embarrassed to be in the group because he didn't like the way the group did to the people in Oceania. Because his party watches everything the people doing in Oceania, and he was also one of the people who were watched by the group. So also there were other things like strict rules, and one of the rules were you cannot have any relationship, for example, not even friendship or sexual relationship. And that's why people who lived in Oceania hate the party, and they tried to rebel against it, but it always failed. However, Winston writes a diary every day to record the things the group are doing to the people, although the writing diary was illegal. Then one day he meets a woman named Julia, and he falls in love with her at the first moment. But he was afraid to tell her that he loves her because it was illegal, like I tell you, to have a sexual relationship with another person. Then one day he receives a letter from Julia, and it was written "I love you." So despite the risk of being captured by the police, Winston chooses to have a love with Julia. So when they go to date, they go out of Oceania and have a date and come back to Oceania. But it was too complicated for them to do that every time. So they were having hard time having relationship between them. Then one day they hear a group of people who would rebel against the party, so they get interested and tries to join the rebellion. Then a guy named O'Brien says he's the leader of this rebellion, and he would support both of them. So Winston talks about the relationship with Julia to O'Brien, and O'Brien talks about everything related to that, and they go back to their own houses. Then when Winston comes back to his house, he was really happy to meet a guy like O'Brien who had the same idea with him. So he tries to fall asleep with Julia. Then the police comes into his house and capture both Winston and Julia. So why this happened was O'Brien was not a rebellion. He was a spy who was capturing people from rebellion. So they got tortured, and the torture was to forget the things they did in the past. And after the torture and when they were released, Winston and Julia both forgot who they were and didn't recognize both of them. And now to analyze the character, Winston is the main character of this novel, and he was one of the member in the party of totalitarianism. Although he could have a big power in that party, he tried to rebel against the party of his own, and this shows how he was so brave to fight alone. But the thing that mattered was he wasn't smart enough to rebel against the group because he was just too friendly to every people. He didn't recognize O'Brien would be the spy to capture him. And now to talk about O'Brien. O'Brien is a person who is in a higher position than Winston in that group, and he was a smart but a cruel guy because he tried to captured Winston with a cruel reason, and he finally achieved his goal, and he tries to capture other person like Winston. And lastly, now to talk about my reflection about this book is, after I read this book, I was very shocked because even though it was hyperbolic, it was very similar to the dictatorship of Nazi and dictatorship of Korea from 1950s to 1980s, and it showed how cruel it will be when a ruling party is totalitarianism. And I think it was the purpose of this book is for us to remind how cruel it was to have a totalitarianism nation, and we should never have a nation like that anymore. So I hope that in the future there will not be any totalitarianism nation forever. Thank you.